Okay, following on from that, Nebuchadnezzar erected a statue, 90 feet high gold statue, and he demanded that at certain times everybody in Babylon should bow down and worship that statue. If we just read what it said in Daniel chapter 3 verse 4, then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And I thought, that's not worship. If you demand worship, if you force people to worship on pain of death, if you don't, then that is not worship, surely. Because worship is a response of the heart. And our worship of God is a response of our hearts to God's love for us. And so this forced, demanded behaviour that Nebuchadnezzar was wanting was not worship. But he thought it was. And so when they heard the sound of the music, they were to fall down and worship this statue. Is it only worship? Is it worship if it only starts when you begin to hear when you hear the musical instruments begin to play? Please. Yeah. Is it just worship when we're in there in the second meeting and the instruments are playing and we start to sing? It maybe takes us 2 or 3 choruses to get warmed up, and then we're into worship, and then the music stops and we're on to something else. Because to me that's not worship either. Paul writes, doesn't he, rejoice evermore. In everything give thanks. Worship is not just something we do when we're singing together on a Sunday morning or a Saturday evening or whenever it is. Worship should be our way of life. It should be something that is within us all the time. It is God's ideal for our lives. Because he loves us and wants us to be in that relationship with him. When we see in the book of Revelation, we see there as John sees into his vision of heaven, what does he see? He sees worship. And he sees continual worship of God. But if we're honest, we fall short of that, don't we? Our lives are not worshipping God continually because we allow the things of everyday life to rob us of that. But God's ideal for us is that we live lives of worship because he loves us. This close worshipping relationship with him that he's made possible because he sent Jesus to die and rise again. And so when we come on a Sunday morning and start singing the choruses, yes, that is part of our worship. That is our worshipping lives coming together in a collective expression of praise and adoration to God. Or at least that's what it should be. But it certainly isn't what Nebuchadnezzar tried to force the people of Babylon and all the other nations who were living in Babylon to do. That is not worship. So who were Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego? If we go back to Daniel chapter 1, if you remember, we said when we were introducing this before Christmas that there were 3 times Jews were taken away into Babylon. There were 3 separate occasions. And on the second occasion, it says this: the king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered that Israelites of the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He said, these are the sort of people I want you to bring from Judah into Babylon at this time. And we've seen that in among those men that were taken, those young men that were taken, were Daniel. But there were also others, and three of the others were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And when they went to Babylon, they were given Babylonian names. And Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Shadrach. Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were three young men who had been taken off to Babylon at the same time as Daniel. They went through the same process as Daniel. If you remember, they wanted to give them, feed them on the food from the king's table, which was food that had been offered to idols, and Daniel said no. And Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were included in that. And it says, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them, that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to them. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And then we find at the end of chapter 2, when Daniel is made ruler over Babylon, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, at Daniel's request, were appointed administrators within the kingdom of Babylon. And so Daniel remained at the royal court in the palace as overall ruler, and they were sent out to different areas to be the administrators. So that's who they were. But there's something else that we need to notice here, and it's something we've mentioned before. They were people of one kingdom, Judah, living in another kingdom, Babylon. More importantly, they were people of God's kingdom, living in a kingdom where they did not follow God's laws. And so we see in there is this conflict for Daniel, which we've talked about previously, and also for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because God said, didn't he, you shall have no other gods before me. God had said, do not worship idols. And so there is immediate conflict for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this. And how do they resolve that? How do they square this up? And of course the answer is they can't. And this isn't just something out of history. There are Christians today, our brothers and sisters in Christ, in other countries where there are oppressive regimes who are going right now at this moment through similar things. Where there is a conflict between God's laws and the laws of the regime that they are living under. And they choose to obey God's laws under pain of imprisonment, torture, and death. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego choose to disobey Nebuchadnezzar's decree. Chapter 3, verse 8, it says this: at this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, and repeated it. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. And so these astrologers. Now, do you remember in the end of chapter 1, it said that when Nebuchadnezzar had questioned Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole of his kingdom. And therefore he appointed them to positions of authority. So I think these astrologers were looking for an opportunity to get in, to have a go at the Jews, to turn Nebuchadnezzar against them, to say, look, these people whom you appointed are not following your rules, because they felt they should have had those positions. They were jealous of, of these people and their positions. And so there is accusation. But of course we need to remember, don't we, that this works on 2 levels. It isn't just on an earthly level, it's also on a spiritual, heavenly level. And we've been looking at Ephesians chapter 6, where it says the battle is not against flesh and blood, but the battle is against spiritual powers in the heavenly realm. They were in a spiritual battle as well. There was a spiritual accusation against them, because Satan would seek to destroy the Jews. And as we look through the Old Testament, we can see time and again where that has happened. And so we need to see this on a spiritual level as well as on an earthly level. And so Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are brought before Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar questions him. He says, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Their reply was this: Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So if they sat down and thought about it, in earthly terms, that probably isn't what they would have said. Was it bravado? Was it bluster? I don't think so. These people had a real faith. You see, they refused to worship the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, but they hadn't stopped worshipping God. They hadn't stopped serving him. They hadn't stopped their relationship with him. And so, they say these words, which as you read on, you realise that just annoyed Nebuchadnezzar even more. But as we read on, we also find that it was a witness to him. That, as Keith told us last week, this is all part of God working in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And so there is a challenge by Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, really, isn't it? It's saying, our God or your God. And we'll find out who is the true God. It reminded me of Elijah on Mount Carmel. You know, when he challenged the prophets of Baal. And the prophets of Baal set up their altars and their sacrifices, and they danced round it and shouted, and Elijah made fun of them and said, look, your God's deaf. Can't hear. And nothing happened. And then Elijah set up his altar with his sacrifice, and then he poured water all over it. And he prayed, and the whole thing was consumed by fire. And so here we have, I think, a similar situation with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, challenging Nebuchadnezzar, but it is a challenge in the spiritual realm as well. So when this came, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were ready. And they were ready because they were in a living, worshipping relationship with God. In New Testament terms, they had their armour on. They didn't have to go looking for it. They were ready. They were ready for whatever was going to happen. Been watching the Winter Olympics? Yeah, where people just seem to sort of find pieces of wood and hurl themselves down steep hills and so on. Did you see the chap who, Don Parsons, who won got the bronze in the what they call the skeleton, but they don't slide on skeletons. This guy has something that looks like trays. And they interviewed his mum, and his mum obviously was very proud. And she said this is the result of 11 years' work. And I thought about that. So for 11 years he's been training. But his training hasn't just been, we'll go and train a couple of times a week and then we'll get on with the rest of life as normal, which I must admit tends to be my attitude to going to the gym. But it took over his whole life. So there was the training, there was the equipment, there was the expense, it affected his whole lifestyle, how he lived his life, the people that he mixed with, that he surrounded himself with, the right people. The things that he ate, the things that he drank, the places he went, the sacrifices he made for 11 years so that he was ready to slide down this track. And they do 4 runs, and each run takes about 50 seconds. So if you work that out, that's about 3 minutes. So for 11 years he's been preparing for 3 minutes. But that's how it should be with us. We should be ready. We should be prepared. We should, for whatever comes our way. When Paul's talking about the spiritual warfare, he talks about standing and having done everything. Stand. Well, you can only do that if you're ready. You can only do that if prepared. It's no good if when the attack comes you have to go, where did I leave my belt of truth? Has anybody seen my breastplate of righteousness? I must admit I'm a bit like that with sunglasses. Yeah, just a tuck there from Carol. Yeah, I have prescription sunglasses, I've got a spare pair, and if it hasn't been sunny for a few days, I can never find either pair. But it's no good being like that with our spiritual armour. We need to be prepared and ready at all times, just as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were. So they could stand before King Nebuchadnezzar, who proclaimed himself King of Kings, and say to him, you cannot do anything to harm us, because our God is greater than you. And even if he doesn't deliver us, we know we will be safe with him. Their faith was practical. Their faith was an everyday faith. Their faith was a continual faith, and it was a prepared faith that meant that they were ready whenever this challenge had come. And so Nebuchadnezzar's reaction, as we said, he was furious. How dare they speak to me like this? How dare they disobey my decree? He heated the furnace as hot as he could get it. So hot that when the soldiers threw them into the furnace, the soldiers themselves were killed because of the heat. And then somehow with the construction of this furnace, Nebuchadnezzar was able to see into it. And he could see that there were 4 men in the furnace. That they weren't being burnt up, that they weren't dying, they weren't being consumed. And he said, and the 4th one looks like a son of the gods. Now I'm not sure, I tried to look this up to find out what did that mean. What did Nebuchadnezzar mean? What was it about this 4th person that Nebuchadnezzar could say, this looks like a son of the gods? And I don't know. I thought maybe he was glowing, but they were all glowing, so it couldn't have been that. But God was there in the furnace with them. The God who they trusted, the God who put their faith in, the God who they worshipped. He was in the furnace with them, and they were not being harmed by this intense heat. You know, very often if we have a difficult situation in our lives, or sometimes, we can do it, we look at difficult situations in the world, some of the terrible atrocities that we have seen, and we say, where is God in that? Where is God in when I'm going through this difficult situation? Where is God when there's a school shooting in America? Where is God when there's an earthquake or a tsunami? And hundreds of people are killed and people are left homeless and suffering and so on. And the answer is here, isn't it? In this verse, in Daniel chapter 3, verse 25, we have the answer, because God was there in the furnace with them. And in every situation, God is there with you and with the people who are suffering. And we may ask the question, well, why do we have to go through those situations? Why do those things happen? And I believe it comes back to this, that in heaven it won't be like that. But we're not in heaven. Although we are of heaven, we are of God's kingdom, we are not yet in heaven. And on the earth, these things happen. There is death. There is decay. There is sadness. There are tears. But it tells us in heaven none of those things will be there. Why did Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego have to go through the furnace? Why, if God was going to be there in the furnace with them, why didn't he deliver them from it? Why did they have to go through it? Now, I'm not going to say that I fully know the mind of God, because we can't do that. But I think we can see in here one reason, and that reason is as a witness to King Nebuchadnezzar. And sometimes the things that we go through are a witness to those around us when they can see in us the faith that we have in our God. But no, we cannot always understand. We cannot always work it out. And that's where faith and trust come into it, isn't it? But Nebuchadnezzar realized that the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, the God of the Israelites, the one true God, he realized his power. He realized his greatness. And there was a response in Nebuchadnezzar's heart. Now, as we've said, Nebuchadnezzar was on a journey, and it was a long journey, and it took a long time. But that's all right, because we're all like that as well. But Nebuchadnezzar's response is this: praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And so he recognizes this. He recognizes this witness that there has been in these 3 men. And then he says, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. So he wasn't quite there yet. but he was getting there. And then, of course, we find that these accusers who'd come along and said, these people you've given authority throughout Babylon, they've done this. What happens in the end? The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. So he gave them even more power and more status and more authority within Babylon. What about us? When we look at Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, we see their lives, their relationship with God, which gave them that confidence, which gave them that depth of faith, that they were able to stand before the king and say, you can't harm us. Have we got that? Because it's what God wants us to have. I was talking to somebody the other week and I was saying, I'm worried about certain things that are coming up. And they said to me, these weren't their exact words, but it was something like, you need to trust God. What God actually said in my head when I heard these words was, pull yourself together, stop moaning and trust God. And yes, that's what I needed to do. And I know why I wasn't doing it. I wasn't doing it because in that particular situation I'd been asking God to do certain things and he hadn't done them. And I'd allowed that. I suppose I was sulking really, wasn't I? Because I hadn't got my way. But you see, God doesn't always do things the way we want him to do them. And his timing isn't always the same as our timing. But I tell you this, it's better. So we need to have that lives of worship and lives of faith. Worship not just something that we turn on when we come in on a Sunday morning. And faith not just something that we go to when we need it. Like the 999 emergency telephone call. But this is how God calls us to live our lives. Because there is a spiritual battle going on. And we are called to stand. And I believe that in that standing, we will also witness. Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. We thank you for their faith. And we thank you for the way that you honoured their faith and that you were with them in that furnace and that you delivered them without even the smell of smoke on their bodies. And Lord, we thank you that you call us to be a worshipping, faithful people. And we just ask that by your Holy Spirit you would help us, you would enable us to take hold of this, Lord. To have this powerful, everyday, practical relationship with you. Not just to turn it on and off when we want to, or when we feel we need to. But Lord, just to grow deeper into you, to know more of you. Lord, that we might indeed stand. And that we might, as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego did, that we might bear witness to the true and living God.